4 centuries after Jamestown's wooden palisades rotted into the soil, science has dragged one of its most privileged secrets into the light. It began, not with a history book, but with a coffin pulled from under the chancel of the settlement's church, resting exactly where only the most powerful colonists were buried. Inside lay the remains of a man, celebrated as a gentleman's soldier, honored with a lavish military sash, and remembered in colonial records as kin to the governor himself. But when scientists sequenced fragments of his DNA, the data didn't just match him to another high-ranking burial nearby. It told a story the family never intended anyone to hear. A story that crossed oceans, stained noble bloodlines, and was carefully erased from official records for over 400 years. What they uncovered wasn't just a genealogical curiosity. It was a revelation that forces us to rethink what we thought we knew about the men who built and tried to control the first English foothold in America. Applause. Jamestown isn't just another archaeological site. It's a crime scene, a burial ground, and a living laboratory rolled into one. Since 1994, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project has been peeling back layers of earth to reveal the skeleton of America's first permanent English colony, post holes from fort walls, shards of 17th century pottery, corroded weapons, even butchered horse bones from the desperate winter of 1609. But in recent years, trowels and brushes have been joined by tools the colonists could never have imagined: ancient DNA sequencers, capable of reading genetic code that has survived in bone for centuries. The process isn't simple. DNA degrades over time, breaking into tiny fragments, and the damp soils of Virginia are brutal to organic material. But teeth and dense bones like femurs act as time capsules, protecting microscopic strands of genetic material. Researchers start by working in clean room conditions to avoid contamination. Full body suits, filtered air, sterilized instruments. A small sample, often from the dense inner dentine of a tooth, is ground into powder. Chemical solutions then extract any surviving DNA, which is sequenced and compared to both modern databases and other ancient samples. In this case, they weren't just looking for European ancestry. That part was expected. They zeroed in on mitochondrial DNA, the genetic blueprint passed down from mother to child almost unchanged for thousands of years. As geneticist Johannes Krauss has explained in his work on ancient remains, mitochondrial DNA is a biological family crest. Once 2 people share a rare sequence, it's a flashing neon sign of shared maternal ancestry. This approach has already solved some of history's coldest cases. In 2012, researchers identified the remains of King Richard III after his skeleton was found under a parking lot in Leicester, England, according to a 2014 study led by researcher Tory King. In 2018, scientists linked plague victims from medieval London to bacterial strains in Central Asia, helping pinpoint the Black Death's origin. According to research led by Maria Spiro and her team, published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Now, the same forensic precision was about to rewrite the story of 2 high-status men in Jamestown and expose a truth their family had tried to keep underground for centuries. To understand why 2 men ended up buried with honor under a church floor in a mosquito-infested swamp, we have to rewind to early 17th century England, a country desperate for power, profit, and prestige. By 1600, Spain had already claimed huge swaths of the Americas, from the silver-rich mountains of Peru to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. England was a latecomer in this high-stakes race for empire, and its leaders feared being boxed out of the New World's wealth. As historian Karen Koerman points out, the Chesapeake region offered England a foothold to challenge Spanish dominance and tap into trade with the indigenous nations inland. In 1606, King James V granted the Virginia Company of London a charter to plant a colony in North America. The goals were bold and vague. They hoped to find gold, secure new trade routes to Asia, and establish a profitable export economy. But behind those official aims was another motive: prestige. A successful colony would signal that England was ready to compete with Spain and Portugal on the global stage. The Virginia Company gathered 104 men and boys for the voyage, launching in December 1606 aboard 3 ships: the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery. The trip took over 4 months, with the men enduring cramped quarters, rancid food, and outbreaks of disease. According to maritime historian David Cordingley, transatlantic voyages at the time had mortality rates as high as 20%, and that was before they even reached hostile shores. When they finally dropped anchor in May 1607, the site they chose was a swampy peninsula along the James River. It offered a deep water harbor and was easy to defend. But it also came with brackish, undrinkable water, clouds of mosquitoes, and little fertile soil. In hindsight, it was a disaster waiting to happen. From the start, Jamestown was a gamble, and the odds were stacked against survival. The men who stepped off the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery were mostly ill-prepared for the work ahead. Many were gentlemen unused to manual labor, artisans without farming experience, or soldiers trained for combat, not cultivation. The environment wasted no time punishing them. The James River's brackish water triggered waves of dysentery and typhoid. Mosquitoes carried malaria, sapping strength from settlers who were already malnourished, and the site's swampy terrain limited fresh water and fertile ground for crops. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of roughly 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes, swung between cautious trade and open hostility. When tensions rose, Powhatan warriors could easily surround and cut off the settlement, knowing the colonists had little food stored. The most infamous chapter came in the winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered simply as the Starving Time. The colony was under siege. Food supplies were gone, and reports describe settlers eating rats, snakes, shoe leather, anything to survive. Archaeological evidence has confirmed the grim accounts. In 2012, Jamestown rediscovery archaeologists found the butchered remains of a teenage girl nicknamed Jane, with cut marks consistent with survival cannibalism. According to the Smithsonian's forensic analysis, this is the earliest physical evidence of cannibalism in any English colony in North America. Mortality was staggering. Historian Linda Walsh notes that between 1607 and 1624, about 7,300 people arrived in Virginia, but only 1,200 were alive by 1625. In the Starving Time alone, the population plummeted from around 300 to just 60 survivors. Against this backdrop of desperation, burial practices took on deep meaning. Most colonists were interred in simple graves outside the fort, but a select few leaders, high-ranking gentlemen, and men of exceptional status were buried inside the church itself. Those floor burials were not just about faith, they were a clear statement of rank. And it was under the floorboards of one such church that the 4 graves at the heart of this mystery were discovered more than 400 years later. By the early 1600s, Jamestown's spiritual and political heart was its Anglican church. The first was little more than a crude wooden structure. But by 1608, a sturdier timber-framed church stood within the triangular walls of James Fort. It wasn't grand by European standards, but in the New World, it was the colony's most sacred and prestigious space. For England's elite, burial location mattered. Being interred within the church close to the altar wasn't just about religious devotion, it was a public marker of status. In England, this was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and powerful, and the same tradition followed settlers across the Atlantic. In 2013 and 2014, archaeologists from the Jamestown Rediscovery Project excavating the site of that 1608 church found something extraordinary. Under the chancel, the area near the altar, lay 4 graves, perfectly aligned and carefully constructed. These were not hurried burials. The coffins were crafted with skill, and 2 stood out for their quality. One contained a textile so delicate it shouldn't have survived, a spangled military sash woven with silver threads and sequins. According to textile historian Margaret Ordóñez, military sashes of this type were rare and highly symbolic, often worn by officers of rank, sometimes as ceremonial regalia. Artifacts, coffin placement, and historical records allowed archaeologists to hypothesize the occupants' identities. Reverend Robert Hunt, the colony's first Anglican minister, died in 1608. Captain Gabriel Archer, an early leader and critic of John Smith, dead by 1610. Sir Ferdinando Wenman, a cousin of Governor Thomas West, and the first English knight buried in America, dead by 1610. Captain William West, a young gentleman soldier, also related to the governor, killed in a clash with Powhatan warriors. But while the historical evidence seemed solid, the team wanted confirmation. And they suspected these graves might tell them far more than just names. It was time to let science speak for the dead. In the rigid social order of early 17th century England, power wasn't just about titles, it was about bloodlines. Governor Thomas West, known formally as Lord de la Warr, embodied that reality. Born into the English gentry, he was a man whose authority in Virginia flowed as much from family connections as from royal appointment. When West arrived in Jamestown in June 1610, he didn't come alone. He brought, or was soon joined by, a network of relatives, brothers Francis, John, and Nathaniel, along with cousins and other gentlemen of status. This was no coincidence. Aristocratic families often used overseas ventures to place younger sons and kin in positions of opportunity. In return, those relatives reinforced the family's influence in the new colony. Among these were Sir Ferdinando Wenman and Captain William West. Colonial records named them both as kinsmen of the governor. Wenman, a seasoned soldier and the first English knight buried on American soil, died of illness within months of arriving. Captain William West's fate was even shorter, killed in a skirmish with Powhatan warriors not long after his arrival. Both were buried in the church chancel, their status cemented in death. But here's the thing. Kinsman was a flexible term in the 17th century. It could mean cousin, nephew, in-law, or even a more distant connection wrapped in the prestige of shared lineage. For the Jamestown elite, those kinship claims mattered, especially in a fledgling colony where leadership legitimacy could be fragile. Still, the historical paperwork never fully explained the exact relationship between Wenman and West. And in a society obsessed with bloodlines, that absence was unusual. It was as if part of the family tree had been intentionally blurred. Archaeologists had their suspicions, but it would take ancient DNA to reveal why that blank spot existed, and whose reputation it was meant to protect. When scientists extracted genetic material from the teeth and bones of the men buried under Jamestown's church chancel, they expected the DNA results to confirm what the historical records already suggested, that Captain William West and Sir Ferdinando Wenman were related through the prestigious West family's paternal line. The first findings were unsurprising. Both men were of European descent, consistent with their English gentry status. But when the team focused on mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child, the results were impossible to ignore. The sequences were identical. Not similar in a way you might expect for distant cousins, but an exact match. In genetic terms, that meant the two men shared the same maternal ancestry, perhaps a mother, grandmother, or other recent female ancestor. As geneticist Johannes Krauss has described in similar cases, mitochondrial DNA can act like a biological fingerprint for a maternal family line. And that created a problem. The documented West family tree had no such close maternal link between these two men. According to the official records, they were connected through the male West line, not the female side. If the paperwork was right, this match shouldn't exist. In the sterile, climate-controlled lab, the DNA didn't lie. But the family genealogy, it seemed edited. The discovery set off a new kind of investigation, one not in the soil, but in centuries-old legal records, wills, and letters. Somewhere in those faded lines of ink lay the reason the family's story didn't match its DNA. What historians found next didn't just rewrite Jamestown's history, it uncovered a scandal the English elite had hidden for 4 centuries. The breakthrough came not from a new excavation, but from a stack of brittle papers in England's archives. While combing through probate files and court documents connected to Captain William West, researchers found a small but explosive clue, a testimony that identified his mother not as the wife of a West patriarch, but as Elizabeth West, the unmarried aunt of Governor Thomas West. Elizabeth West never married in 17th century aristocratic England. That fact alone was enough to make the next part of the story a scandal, because if William was her son, he was born out of wedlock, making him illegitimate in the eyes of both church and crown. Among England's gentry, illegitimacy wasn't just a private embarrassment. It could bar a child from inheriting titles or estates, derail political ambitions, and tarnish an entire family's standing. That's why such births were often hidden behind layers of vague language, fostered in secrecy, or woven into the family narrative in a way that masked the truth. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. William West was raised and treated as a gentleman, given a military commission, and sent to Virginia where his noble connections could serve both him and the colony. Official records described him as the governor's kinsman, which was technically true, but avoided spelling out the exact relationship. The mitochondrial DNA made the hidden link impossible to deny. William and Sir Ferdinando Wenman weren't just political allies or distant cousins, they were bound by a maternal connection strong enough to cut through 400 years of secrecy. According to Jamestown Rediscovery's lead archaeologists, this is the first documented case where ancient DNA has been used to prove illegitimacy in early colonial America's upper class, and the implications go beyond one family. It's a reminder that the polished portraits and dignified titles of the past often mask the same human dramas we see today: ambition, loyalty, and the desperate need to protect reputations. History books often present Jamestown's leaders as symbols of discipline, faith, and noble sacrifice, men who carried England's honor into the wilderness. But the DNA results remind us that these were also deeply human figures, navigating the same messiness of family politics, ambition, and personal secrets as anyone today. The revelation about William West's parentage doesn't diminish his service or Wenman's stature. Instead, it adds layers to their stories and forces historians to confront how much of early colonial history was shaped not just by ideals, but by the careful management of image. According to Jamestown Rediscovery archaeologists, the find shows how archaeology and genetics can expose truths that paper records intentionally avoided. It also marks a first. Never before has ancient DNA been used to uncover illegitimacy in America's earliest English elite. That sets a precedent for how similar methods could challenge or confirm the pedigrees of other prominent colonial families. The church chancel graves are just a fraction of Jamestown's buried population. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed dozens of unexcavated features inside and outside the fort's footprint, many likely to be graves. Future work could pair ancient DNA with isotope analysis, which can identify where a person grew up and even the types of food they ate. Environmental DNA, eDNA, from soil samples might reveal traces of disease pathogens, adding more detail to the colony's health crisis. And Jamestown isn't alone. Across the world, sites from Viking ship burials to plague pits in London are being re-examined with these same technologies. Each test has the potential to overturn long-accepted histories or confirm suspicions that historians have whispered about for centuries. For more than 4 centuries, the truth about William West's birth lay buried under the same forces that shaped Jamestown itself: family loyalty, rigid social hierarchy, and the relentless drive to protect reputations. Paper records were edited, relationships blurred, and inconvenient facts quietly omitted from the family's official history. But soil doesn't lie, and neither does DNA. The graves beneath Jamestown's church didn't just hold the remains of the colony's elite, they cradled a secret so carefully guarded that it survived generations, until a fragment of maternal DNA broke the silence. It's a reminder that history is never truly finished. The past may be written in ink, but it can be rewritten by a tooth, a bone, or a single strand of genetic code. And if one small patch of ground in Virginia can reveal a scandal that shook the foundations of an aristocratic family, imagine what else is still waiting to be uncovered beneath our feet. At Stone and Bone, we believe every layer of dirt has a story, and every story has the power to change how we see the world. So, if you want more journeys into the places where science meets history, from ancient DNA to long-forgotten ruins, make sure to subscribe and join us. Because the next secret could be just one dig away.